The Health Services Consultative Committee released its annual report a few weeks back, which was mildly critical of the Health Department. Outgoing Chair Andrew Cole, in an interview with Isle of Man TV about his committee's report, suggested that the Health Minister tried to bully his committee. Minister Hooper strongly refutes this allegation and, as we'll hear later, describes the report as riddled with errors. In the meantime, the broadcaster who conducted the interview, Paul Moulton, is deeply concerned that there appears to be an attempt to silence public debate.
Should we do the FOIs on that first then? Yeah, obviously this is an ongoing, it feels like a battle, to be honest. It's very simple. I just want a certain document, and I'm pretty confident that document is around somewhere. Clearly we've drawn a lot of dots, but we do need to have it officially given over. Now, the whole reason for the FOI is to assist the public. We are on a man where we're meant to be open and honest and transparent, and you name all these words that are used. I've been blocked constantly.
And the importance of this document is
massive.
Explain.
Well,
I mean, you can explain without naming people.
It's not even that. I'm not even sure how far I want to go, in the sense it certainly could be a major part of the Dr. Ranson issue when advice was given to the Isle of Man government. It was on Friday the 13th of March 2020. On Friday there was Dr. Ranson's full thing, which was closing the borders and so on. But by Monday, it seems, and I have to be very careful here because I haven't seen the documents, but that wasn't the same information that allegedly went to the Comin. So something happened over that weekend, and that's what all I'm trying to do is find that out, because it's really, really important. If the chief medical officer, her information was altered by someone who was not a medical person, I mean, again, we need to find out exactly what has gone on, who did what and why.
And until you see that document, or the documents referred to, it's difficult to know what actually went on, because if the document said Dr. Ranson has advised such and such, however, the department has decided something else, perhaps the fact that document hasn't been released then leaves everyone in a position where they have to speculate.
Well, we're pretty sure it's in the bundles, that have been laid. So so what's happened is I heard that the Clerk of Tynwald has been issued the bundle. So I wrote him this letter and repeated some things about what I think was going on, but it was all, I understand, allegedly, that sort of thing. So obviously the Clerk of Tynwald, someone there, so went to Jim Watson as well, has thrown it back to DHSC and these three people that were named by me. So I get a defamation letter Wednesday, and it was these three people, but also the DHSC. Now, there's not one word in my document about the DHSC for defamation can't be brought. I mean, it's absolute nonsense, but it kind of means that it's Laurie Hooper's department who sent that, and then this Twitter spat broke out.
And of course there was a spat just before Tynwald started as well, with yourself and Laurie Hooper.
Well, because on the Friday I'd done that interview with a gentleman who he didn't even want to do it. I mean, he felt like he had nowhere else to go, and I've become that sort of person that people can go to. So he's the outgoing chair of the Isle of Man Health Services Consultative Committee, Andrew Cole. Yeah. And he made some things there, and I kind of, it was jaw dropping. I'm not going to repeat now. You can the interviews on Isle of Man TV on YouTube, but it's worth a watch, because this is a man who he clearly doesn't want to be doing the interview. And I was amazed how far he was prepared to go, and I think that's admirable. But I said twice in the interview, I now need to speak to Laurie Hooper, and I looked at the camera lens and said we will be in touch with Laurie Hooper. Twice on that interview. I sent him an email to two different addresses when I came off, and the thing had gone live. I got no response. That was Monday. So I saw him on Tuesday before Tynwald. He was in Tynwald. I said, Laurie, will you do an interview? And it was just not the response I was expecting, shall we say, because he didn't want to talk to me, basically. He said basically I was biased and wouldn't, he didn't acknowledge me. And you got an interview with him. You're obviously a trusted person, or a qualified journalist or whatever. I mean, the spat was getting a bit balmy the other day, that he said he didn't seem to know about the letter. Now, if he's the minister and he didn't know, we got the same situation as we had with Mr. Collister when a digital signature was applied by presumably a civil servant.
So he doesn't know about the defamation letter.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say, because he said to me, "Well, you publish it," and I'm going, "Well, this is bonkers, because it's your department who must know about it and have instructed Callum Wilde to act on your behalf. Not even the AGs, by the way. This is all very interesting, because I think Callum Wilde could find themselves slightly conflicted because of all the other things that are going on here. So, I mean, not the most interesting thing to have happened to me that day, but it was lively, and I don't know what's going on with Laurie here, because to be sort of so public on Twitter is unusual, and I think there's a code of conduct that the ministers have to adhere to, which may have been
questions were asked about this in Tynwald.
It was,
and
that's another spat between two others, by the way. I didn't find out that the other day. I didn't know what that was about, but there's other spats going on. But no, I mean, is that really the place to do that and try and drag me into it? I mean, okay, it's a very strange way to deal with this whole thing. I then had to engage, thank goodness, of somebody who has got lawyer experience, and we've done, I think it's a 13-page rebuttal. But what it's done, it's now made it into the public arena, this thing. They've rolled the dice, which was possibly not the best thing, in my view. I've got to be very careful on this thing, because now we have something that is going to roll. I mean, if they're going to press me to apologise to these three individuals, apologise to DHSC, which wasn't even mentioned, so I can't apologise for something I haven't done, and also retract the video where I apparently made some things. I mean, this all happened, by the way. The letter went a month ago, and I get a letter yesterday and asking me to remove it by the Friday. And the actual physical letter only turned up this morning, the day of Friday, when we're recording this. Things aren't adding up here at all. I've obviously, those three FOIs, I've now moved it up to the Information Commissioner, which, and sadly, we're now in limbo, and no one knows what the new guy is going to be like. If we wait to see that he's going to be as on the ball, maybe as the previous one. This has got to be the most worrying thing about freedom of information and freedom of the Manx press.
And this is the nub of this, isn't it?
It is.
Because it is so important.
I can't believe
that
the other
politicians are willing to be open and talk to the media. Perhaps there's a misunderstanding amongst a number of Tynwald members, perhaps a level of naivety amongst Tynwald members, that in some way the media is there merely to report what they have to say, whereas actually we are there to scrutinise and, on behalf of the public,
we have jobs to
ensure that
I promise you,
people find out about
all the
things.
years I've been doing this, and I'm not a qualified journalist. I've worked for the BBC and ITV, but I have not got any qualifications. But it's something that I can do, I think, pretty okay. Even I've said myself, every person I've interviewed, we can have some really heated debates, but when we finish it, it's parked, because it's just, I'm doing the job of asking questions, you've got to answer them or not, and we move on. I mean, it just doesn't happen like this. For Laurie Hooper, the minister, now to refuse to do an interview with me because he didn't like, I'm guessing, that interview. And you know what I was going to do? I was going to ask him to do the rebuttals.
And one of the things, I mean, because I've been the other side of your microphone and camera lens,
and we've given you a hard time.
And the thing that I liked was you gave me as much time as I was prepared to speak for. To explain what I was about.
And we've had some quite hefty, but we always walk away with it just as you do. It's just a job. You've got your job, I've got my job.
Yeah.
But can I say, at the time of recording this, there's been so. I mean, we are doing this interview, admittedly, but there's nothing else happening. I mean, the press on the Isle of Man, Manx Radio, their newsroom, everyone at Isle of Man newspapers and the other stations. Surely this is of interest.
Well, to be fair, this is Manx Radio.
You know what I mean, though. It hasn't made the news. It happened yesterday. It's not going as a news story until you pass this information on. I kind of really worry about that, because is everyone else just happy that potentially the journalists on the Isle of Man are going to be bullied, certainly compromised, if they think they're going to be getting a lawyer's letter over something? This is so serious. I literally don't know how you probably hear the anger, and also it upsets me. This is not good for anyone to have to deal with this. This is something that I will fight it, and I will go to jail over it if I have to, because this cannot be seen by anyone. And I presume the Chief Minister must be watching what happened there, because it seems an inappropriate way of handling a dispute. A, to send a letter like that, but B, then to kind of go onto Twitter and call me I'm not qualified. I'm a jobbing thing with a camera. I have no right now to cover Tynwald, he thinks, because I don't hit the criteria. I have no code of conduct. This is all bonkers because I've signed up for it years ago. But why would a minister who, and let's also remember, Liberal Vannon comes into this, and on Laurie Hooper's own website, he wants open and transparency and freedom of the press and all this. He's doing everything in the other direction. Now, what happens to Laurie Hooper when he was a backbencher to when Laurie Hooper becomes a minister? And it happens to other people as well, so it's not just him. It's this sort of complete mindset change. He should be inviting more interaction from the media, not shutting us down because he doesn't like an interview. This is still not cleared. There were some major things said on that interview about that man. Laurie Hooper was going to, in my view, come back because he put out a huge Twitter that night saying this is ridiculous. It was hard, and you got the feeling that this is someone that's really, really upset about the whole thing being aired in the first place. Now, that's my responsibility to make that video because that person came to me. I'm not going to stop him. But at the same time, I knew I had to get Laurie's side of the thing. So as of recording, I have no answers to those serious questions that were raised in that interview. And surely he needs to address them. If it's not to me, because he won't talk to me, then to you or somebody else. But it's not good enough that a minister can duck and dive and pick and choose when he'll be available and to who. That's just not. That's a Boris Johnson thing, isn't it, almost? It's crazy.
That was broadcaster Paul Moulton. I've asked the Health Department to comment about the recent lawyer's letter, but had not received a reply prior to preparing agenda for broadcast earlier today. If a statement is released before this show airs, I will, of course, include it. I interviewed Minister Hooper in Tynwald on Tuesday. I asked him first about the nurses' dispute over pay.
I think that's been a concern for a while. We know the Manx Care is carrying a vacancy rate of around 20% across the piece. So what that means is they have to be very careful how they manage staff to make sure there are enough staff on any ward at any given time in order to try and make sure that is safe. And I know Manx Care do their best with that, with the staffing they've got. Part of the challenge linking this in with the pay dispute, obviously, is that you can only spend the money once. So on the one hand, most of the unions have accepted the pay offer that Manx Care have put forward. I know the RCN have not. But on this particular issue, if you're saying, well, we need to pay our existing staff more, you can't then spend that same money hiring more nurses to fill the vacancies. So it's a difficult message to get across, I think, and it's difficult when people are saying both, we need more funding for us, but also we'd like more people employed. Actually, sometimes you can't do both, and you can't do both at the same time quickly. And that is, I think, the position that Manx Care is sort of in, is they're trying to find a way of managing within the financial resources they've got within the budget that's been allocated by Treasury, and they're saying we can make a reasonable pay offer, and they have made a pay offer that was rejected, like I say, by the RCN, but equally they do have an active recruitment and retention program going on, trying to make sure they're increasing their substantive posts and the number of people employed in substantive posts, so there's less reliance on bank and agency staff. These things will take time to be fixed. I'm confident things are better now than they were, say, a year ago or 2 years ago, but it's not an overnight fix, and it isn't something that's going to be resolved, I think, quickly.
One of the arguments that the unions, the medical unions, are making is that actually in real terms pay has diminished over the course of the last decade or so, and as a consequence it is more difficult to actually recruit people into these roles. You, as Minister, have the difficulty, of course, that there is only so much money available to the Manx government, and somehow you've managed so far to have extracted more than many departments. The department has a £10 million top-up a year, so the money ought to be there.
I think the 10-year pay erosion thing is quite an interesting point. So I entered the workforce in 2008, just before the financial crash. So all I've ever experienced in my working life is pay erosion. And that's the reality for, I think, everybody, except in a couple of very specific sectors. I think it is fair to say that most people have suffered significant pay erosion over the last decade. In part, that was financial crash. It was the VAT renegotiation. It was then decisions made by previous governments, both here and across, around what was called austerity, or not austerity on the Isle of Man, but ultimately had a very similar effect on people. And I think that's where we're at after 10 years of this. We are now trying to dig ourselves out of this hole, and it's fair to say that I think most people are at their limit. They've said, actually, we don't like this approach. We cannot accept this continuing additional work with no additional resource, the additional pressure that's piled on people. And I think that's a very fair position to take. It's a position I completely support, which is why I have spent most of my time in the last 2 years arguing for more funding for the Health and Care Service, to make sure that we can pay staff what they're worth, to make sure they feel valued, to make sure they know that they're valued, but also then to make sure we're investing in care pathways, in services, in patients, to making sure the whole system is getting better. I'd love to be able to snap my fingers and say, yes, Treasury, give me extra money, and the reality is I can't do that. And we have to then rely on Manx Care to negotiate with staff to make sure Manx Care are taking all the steps they can take to improve staff morale, make staff feel valued, improve staff well-being, improve staff numbers, and ultimately improve staff pay.
In relation to then the action that the RCN, I understand, are taking I think it's a week's time, have you got any particular concerns about that?
So Manx Care have advised that they're forming what they're calling a strike committee, so it's essentially just going to sit down and work out what the derogations look like, what work is going to stop, who's going to be on staff, what's going to be covered. So my understanding is at the moment, what I'm being told at least, is that we will be running health services on the island, and things aren't just going to stop. Obviously, you can't just stop services, but that very much will be by way of negotiation now between Manx Care and the staff side. So ultimately, I'm hoping they'll come to a sensible resolution that makes sure that patients are protected, that services can still operate even if on a reduced basis, but equally respecting the right of these individual staff members to go out and protest.
Moving on then to a different matter, the Health Services Complaints Committee, is it? Consultative Committee. The Health Services Consultative Committee issued their report, and it's fair to say that you came in for quite a significant amount of criticism from the outgoing chair of that committee. There were accusations that the minister's a bully, the minister's heavy-handed, and this and that. How do you respond to those allegations?
So I haven't actually spoken to the outgoing chair since the new chair was appointed, so this must be 6 months, give or take. So I really don't know what information he has, but for him to make such defamatory statements in public, he must have really strong evidence to back that up, so I really hope that he does. But from my perspective, the HSCC report it contains a raft of errors. There are so many errors in it. Actually, someone's asked me previously, can you do a point-by-point rebuttal? I can't. Actually, there is so much in it that is just wrong. It would be almost impossible for me to do that. Some of the stuff in it that does concern me, though, is the fact that they take information that they have access to. They have complete access to all the information the department has access to. They see everything that I see, almost. And then to present that in a way to the public that can be misleading or misrepresentative, I think is quite concerning. Ultimately, the ultimate concern I have with this body is that they are not acting in accordance with the law. One element in their report describes how they currently operate and states, I think on page 16, that this approach has ministerial support. It categorically does not. I have written to them in the past saying, I think what you're doing is unlawful, you need to change, and they have not. So really, as part of that process, to say the law is the law, you have to follow it. There is no choice there. And whilst you are under my responsibility, it is my responsibility to make sure you follow the law.
I mean, that's a fairly significant point that you're making there. So, you're suggesting the committee is acting unlawfully. What specifically is it that the unlawful nature of their action?
The specific part of the law that they're supposed to be doing is their job, which they repeatedly articulate in their report, is to provide some scrutiny at the moment of quality, performance and activity of health services being delivered. So what I would expect to see from them is information on the quality of health services, the performance of health services and the activity that's being undertaken. And the reality is there is nothing in the report that covers those issues. They are almost entirely focused on DHSC policy work, on strategy development, on legislative work. That's great. That does provide some value. That is quite helpful, but it isn't what the law requires of them. And actually, how
is it though? I mean, policy and legislation are really quite important when it comes to delivering services. So surely to goodness that is within the remit of the committee.
It is, and that's the point that I've tried to make to them repeatedly. It forms part of your remit, but is not the entirety of your remit. The law is very specific as to the things they should be looking at. So when we met recently, I did ask if they could provide me with a view on performance of GP services, of cancer services, of midwifery services, of our restoration and recovery programme, and nothing comes back, and that's the problem.
But in terms of unlawfulness, I mean, you're suggesting the committee's, perhaps you're suggesting the committee isn't following its complete remit, But what it's doing certainly is part of, I would have thought, a reasonable effort to review how services are being delivered by the department.
Unfortunately not. So firstly, Phil, I need to correct you, the department doesn't deliver services, Manx Care delivers services. And in terms of the remit of the committee, it is set down in regulation what they must do. So the fact that they must do multiple things means they are required to do all of those things. You don't get to pick and choose as a statutory body, to say, actually, I'm going to ignore the bits that I'm not interested in. That isn't the way the law works. I mean, if it were, government would operate entirely differently when the law says...
But surely all committees... no committee is capable of doing everything within its remit all at the same time. I mean, you have to dedicate particular time for particular topics, and perhaps at the moment, well, certainly it would appear that the committee, which is independent of the department, has taken the view that these are the issues that are hindering perhaps the delivery of services. So is it not within the gift of the committee to actually make that decision?
It's not within the gift of the committee to ignore the law. That's what it boils down to. And ultimately, the committee's primary focus, as set out in the primary legislation, is to be a consultative body that the department seeks feedback from, which we also do use them for. The reality is, the way our system operates currently, is that what we're missing is that patient voice. So what we're missing is someone to go in and actually look at services from a patient perspective. That is what the committee used to do. If you look back at the old reports, that's the stuff they used to do. They used to look at the actual way services were delivered. And now that isn't what they're doing at all. So something has changed in the last couple of years where they've moved very sharply away from what they used to do, which is what the law told them to do, and they're doing something entirely different because that seems to be their area of primary focus. So my intention with the HSCC is to reform them to be much more patient-centred, so actually acting more like one of the community health boards in Wales or the Health Watch organisations in the UK, who are, by statute, the patient's voice in the development of policy, in the delivery of services. And that's really where there is value in an organisation like this. We have a comprehensive external inspection programmes. We've got clinical experts going in and inspecting clinical services. We now have parliamentary scrutiny committees scrutinising policy and legislation. So we have a lot of...
And of course, you famously said on one of my programmes that perhaps the committee of Tynwald wasn't scrutinising hard enough. So maybe the consultative committee has decided maybe it needs to step in.
That's an interesting point. Actually, in some of the reports, perhaps last year, I think they do criticise elements of Tynwald's performance, which I find quite entertaining. That we've got this body whose job it is to look at the health service actually turning around and criticising the way Tynwald members operate and the way Tynwald functions, which I would argue is very far outside of their remit. But ultimately, the problem we have at the moment is when they are deciding that's what they want to spend their time on, rather than the things the law explicitly says they need to spend their time on, you end up in a difficult position. And then when you get reports like this that contain these sort of significant errors, which just don't get checked. So the first time I saw this full report was when it was sent to Tynwald members. So this body is supposed to report to the department and to Tynwald members, and the way that it works, at least this year, is they hand me the final report when it's in its final form the moment it is published. And I'm a professional auditor. I've written lots of audit reports and things like this, and you would never do that. You would always engage with the client, with the service user, to say, this is a draft, this is what I'm going to produce, is it correct? And actually there's stuff in there which is erroneous, and actually
and of course the issue there, which for those who aren't perhaps familiar with this, is the committee still holds the report. The committee still has the authorship of that report, and the committee can ignore anything that the department may come back with, but not giving the department an opportunity to point out where perhaps the committee has misunderstood a thing. Does seem a strange way of approaching things.
Yeah, so I was sent a copy of what they refer to as their Tynwald brief 2 days before they published it, and asked for comments within 2 days, and this was during a Tynwald sitting, so there was literally no way I could respond to that within that time frame. And it's this kind of action and activity that you think there is a lot of value in this organisation. I really believe that there's a lot of value in having this type of lay scrutiny of services of policy. I think having that lay input really is worthwhile, but in its current form it just isn't working, and that's the biggest challenge. And so when you have these conversations with people and say, look, you're not doing what the law requires, I appreciate the time and effort you're putting in, I appreciate the passion that you have to make things better, but what you're doing is not adding any value. We need to refocus you towards patients and what patients need, And ultimately then you get some of this pushback that says, no, we want to do what we want to do, and that's absolutely fine. But ultimately, you don't get to make that choice. Policy is set by elected politicians, it is set by Tynwald, it is set by government, and that's the way our system works. So if you want to influence that, by all means influence it, but there is a way to influence and a process you use to influence those things. You don't just go on a YouTube video and start throwing out all sorts of quite defamatory accusations.
Is part of the problem here that the department has or the split has occurred between service delivery and policy development, and maybe the legislation governing the committee hasn't moved with the times?
No, so the committee have said that a number of times, but the reality is that legislation has never been a barrier. So the legislation does not entitle them, for example, to access to department meetings or papers. It doesn't do that. But we've always given them access to everything. In fact, we have HSCC members at nearly all of our department meetings. That's always been the way it's done, but there is no specific statutory power for them to do that. Same with Manx Care. Actually, there is no statutory power for them to go in and demand things, but Manx Care have been very opening and very welcoming to them, and they actually, HSC acknowledged that in their report. They say we've attended X number of Manx Care meetings, and they get access to all the same stuff that Manx Care has, so the fact that the statute isn't explicit actually is not a barrier, and has proved not to be a barrier. It is something that has been thrown out a few times, saying we can't do our job because, actually, that turns out that's not true.
Setting aside, then, the whether the committee should or should not be making recommendations and conclusions on the issues that it has, it does raise some fairly important questions. I mean, an obvious one that sprung out to me was legislation appears to be taking a very long time to get through.
So that's one of the erroneous bits of statements in the report. So there are quite a few errors. Some of them around dates. The report itself gives two different dates for what we're calling our Regulation of Care Act, for example. Which of those two dates is correct? I would suggest you go and ask the HSCC that question. They've published two dates in their own report about when they're expecting to see this. Neither are correct, by the way, but they've still managed to publish two separate dates, which goes back to my point around this hasn't even been sort of sense-checked, I think. And so there are definitely delays with our legislative programme across government, that's evident, but as far as I'm concerned from a Department of Health and Social Care perspective, we're broadly on track with where we need to be, but they are long-term plans, they are long-term development of very complex legislation. It's similar with things like the Manx Care Record, for example. That is a 5 to 10 year project. The HSCC are jumping up and down because it hasn't been delivered yesterday. It has always a 5 to 10 year project. That was always going to be the case. And I think this is part of the problem with the report as it currently is it makes these references. You then as the media pick up on it and go, oh, there seems to be a problem here. Actually, that's just incorrect. The facts that behind this are simply incorrect. And then you end up having a conversation around things that have no basis in reality, quite frankly. And I think that's part of the problem. So then instead of being able to talk about the actual things we're trying to do and the actual problems that we're facing, and let's be honest, there are problems that we're trying to deal with, you end up spending quite a lot of time doing interviews like this, trying to correct the record, which should never have been incorrect in the first place.
To be fair, I haven't asked many questions about the report yet, and I would welcome an opportunity, perhaps on a future show, for yourself and representative of the Healthcare Consultative Committee to debate the whole issue. But undoubtedly, I mean, you mentioned that there are errors, but undoubtedly there must be some truth in this report.
I would like to think so, Phil, but I think the problem is when you have errors of this scale, it is difficult then to place reliance on the things in there that you should be able to rely on. And I think that's the problem I've got. So you'd expect reports to have a difference of opinion. I'm expecting these reports to be critical of the department and of Manx Care. Of course I am. That is part of their job as a scrutiny function as it currently stands. That's what I'd expect them to do, is to provide that feedback and say this isn't working well, this is the evidence base that we have. The problem you've got at the moment is the report doesn't provide that evidence base, and so you're almost forced to read it and take it at face value to say what's in there is true or it isn't. And when you know that so much in there isn't accurate, it's really difficult then to say, well, which bits of this are right, and do I invest any time and energy in going through this report almost line by line and fact-checking absolutely everything in it in order to see where the value is. And the reality is I don't have the time for that myself. I don't have the resource in the department to go through and do that, and so ultimately you end up with a report that will go and sit on a shelf somewhere and is unlikely to be taken seriously by anyone. It's unlikely to be actioned simply because of the amount of time and energy and investment it would take to separate the wheat from the chaff within that report. And so, like I said, I really do think there is value in these kind of organisations. I do think there is value in having an independent, patient voice in the development of policy and strategy and overseeing the delivery of services. That isn't what we're currently getting.
Finally then, and this is more, well, there was a question in Tynwald which talked about, in a somewhat opaque sort of way, about ministers' approach to social media. Interestingly, nothing seems to have altered since the 2015 report or proposal, recommendations, whatever they are, in relation or governing ministers' use of social media. Are you one of the ministers? Well, you are one of the ministers that speaks frequently on Twitter, Facebook. You are generally quite robust in your debating style on those platforms. Do you think that the questioner had a reasonable point? Do you think perhaps you are too robust and maybe you need to be a little bit more or a little bit less combative in the way that you approach this?
I actually had assumed that Mr. Glover was referring to the defamatory accusations Mr. Collister had made on social media, as opposed to anything that...
well, he specifically referred to a minister, didn't he?
I suspect he was referring, I assumed he was referring to the then minister, but I say without knowing what Mr. Glover was actually getting at, it's difficult to comment.
Okay. Is it... I mean, do you think people understand just how big and high-pressured the role is of being a minister in the Isle of Man? I mean, we all acknowledge and welcome the fact that ministers are very, very accessible. But is it do you think the public fully appreciate just how big a deal that is when you are one of those ministers who is effectively accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year?
I actually think it's a bit of a surprise to some Tynwald members, to be honest, as well. I think with what we've seen this time around, a number of Tynwald members stepping back from department roles, from government roles, some of them citing workload as one of the reasons for that. So I think it has come as a bit of a shock to a lot of people that when you're in this job, it isn't a 9 to 5. You can't just take the weekend off, and this idea of a long summer holiday is just laughable. So, I mean, in some respects, I think there is a lack of understanding out there amongst people generally, but say amongst Tynwald members as well, seems to be apparent about the scale and the scope of the work that's required. But I think most people understand it. I think most people appreciate the pressures of the job and that it's difficult. And quite frankly, I wouldn't expect the job to be easy. Otherwise, we wouldn't need people to do it, if that makes sense. The job is going to be difficult. There are difficult, complex problems that we're being elected to deal with. And the way that our representative democracy works is because we want people to drill into those issues to deal with the complexity, then we do need to spend time and energy doing that. So it is going to be a complex issue. I think the challenge that we often have as government, as ministers and as Tynwald members more broadly, is then taking those complex issues and explaining them and breaking them down into more easily digestible bits of information that I think anyone can then engage with. And that's always the challenge, because I've never wanted to try and come across like I'm treating the public as like they don't understand, because actually most people absolutely get this stuff. But it's trying to make sure it gets the message out in a way that doesn't come across as being patronising or condescending, but also gets it across in a way that is really engaging for people and gives them the opportunity and the ability to then have a proper conversation about it. And in fairness, I think we're seeing that with things like nursing and residential care. So it's a really big, really complex issue. But actually, since the newspapers published an article this morning on the website, I've seen lots of engagement on social media about the issues. People absolutely get it. They absolutely understand the problems, the challenges, the scope. There's no reason to think they wouldn't. So I don't really think there's any reason for me to believe that when it comes to the role of a minister or the role of a Tynwald member, that people don't generally have a good understanding of what it is that we do.
That was Health Minister Laurie Hooper very robustly defending his department. Do you think he's right to put up such a strong defence of his department? Is Paul Moulton being silenced for dark and nefarious reasons? Is the minister and government right in suggesting that Paul Moulton has an agenda of his own? Whatever the rights and wrongs of all this, the main victim of this public spat appears to be the Health Services Consultative Committee's annual report, which, whether riddled with inaccuracies as the minister suggests or not, asks some searching questions such as, should Treasury act to raise sufficient funds to enable more than just making the most of what we have? The Minister has accepted my invitation to discuss the report on a future programme, and I hope that soon we can get back to talking about the policies and actions of the Health Department rather than having to cover this unedifying public episode. Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.